I never believed in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. Not really. But one weekend at my grandfather's old cabin changed everything. Growing up, I'd visit him every summer until he passed away when I was 15. He'd left the cabin to my parents, but they never really used it. The place was old, creaky, and, as they like to joke, probably haunted. But my grandfather had loved it, and oddly, so did I. Even after he was gone, something about the smell of the pine, the crispness of the mountain air, and the distant calls of birds kept me drawn to it. It had been almost 8 years since I'd been up there, but that fall I decided I needed some time away from the city. My job was slowly eating away at me, and my girlfriend, well, let's just say things were rocky. A few days alone in the mountains sounded perfect, and what better place than the cabin? The drive was mostly uneventful, winding up mountain roads as the forest thickened around me. When I arrived, everything looked just like I remembered. It was quaint, almost charming, with its rough wooden walls and a slight lean from years of harsh winters. I unloaded my bags and did a quick sweep, checking for any signs of unwanted animal visitors. The place was quiet, eerily so. No hum of distant traffic, no chirping of crickets. Just silence. That first night was cold, and I started a fire in the stone fireplace, curling up with a book and a blanket. The sound of crackling would fill the room, and I felt my eyes growing heavy. I wasn't even sure I had drifted off until I heard a distinct creaking, like someone was walking just outside the front door. I sat up, listening, straining to catch any sound. But after a minute, all was silent again. Just an animal, I muttered, settling back in, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to shake off the weirdness from the night before. I made coffee and took a stroll around the cabin. Memories flooded back as I wandered down to the old dock by the lake. I remembered my grandfather teaching me to fish, his rough hands guiding mine. He had been a man of few words, but he always seemed content here. When I returned to the cabin, I froze. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it. Heart pounding, I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. I searched every corner, every closet, but nothing seemed out of place. Maybe I'd just forgotten to close it, but a lingering unease had settled over me. As night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin grew tense. Shadows seemed to flicker just out of sight, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but that night was worse. The same creaking footsteps, only this time they were inside. I listened, paralyzed, as they grew closer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. I was too scared to move, lying there in the dark, clutching the covers like a child. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I lay awake the rest of the night, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the cabin was silent again. When dawn broke, I was exhausted but too afraid to stay. I packed my things, ready to leave, but when I opened the door, something stopped me. A trail of muddy footprints led from the lake to the cabin, fresh and unmistakable. I stared at them, my mind racing. Had someone been watching me from the lake? I followed the trail, each step pulling me closer to the water. It stopped abruptly at the dock, right where I used to fish with my grandfather. The lake was still, a mirror reflecting the gray sky, but I had the sickening feeling that something was watching me from below its surface. I backed away, shivering, and returned to the cabin. I tried to call my parents, but there was no cell signal, no way to reach anyone. With no choice but to stay, I barricaded the door and sat in front of the fireplace, determined to stay awake. I'd just wait out the night and leave at first light. But then I noticed something odd. The walls, specifically the wall behind the fireplace. The wood was different, a shade lighter, as if it had been replaced. I ran my hand over it, feeling the faint grooves of an opening. There was a hidden door there, one I'd never noticed as a kid. My curiosity got the best of me. I found a small latch and pulled. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I hesitated, but something, maybe a sense of duty to my grandfather's memory, compelled me to go down. The air grew colder as I descended, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. And in the center of the room was a table with a dusty, leather-bound book. The book was written in a language I couldn't understand, but the drawings were clear. They depicted rituals, figures in shadowy cloaks, and a creature emerging from the lake. As I flipped through, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just any creature. It was something ancient, something evil. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a faint shuffling. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to move, coiling around me. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the hidden door behind me, and ran back to the living room. The room was different now, darker. Shadows clung to the walls, and a feeling of dread settled over me. I tried to shake it off, but then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner, watching me. It was barely visible, more of a silhouette than a person, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding. I blinked, and it was gone, but the air still felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. I tried to calm myself, rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the power of suggestion from that creepy book. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. Then I heard a whisper, a low, guttural voice calling my name. Daniel. My blood turned to ice. My grandfather was the only one who had ever called me Daniel. Everyone else called me Dan, but he was dead. I'd seen him buried. And yet, the voice was unmistakable. I bolted for the door, desperate to escape, but when I reached it, it wouldn't budge. I yanked, pulled, even kicked, but it was as if the door had fused to the wall. The whisper grew louder, filling the cabin. Shadows swirled around me, and the figure reappeared, closer this time. I stumbled back, heart racing, as it reached out a skeletal hand. Daniel, it rasped, "You've come back." I screamed, thrashing, trying to shake off its grip, but it was like being caught in a nightmare. The figure's face was twisted, barely human, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. It leaned in close, and I caught a whiff of decay, rotten and foul. "You left me," it whispered. "You left us." Suddenly, I remembered something I had long forgotten. My grandfather, standing by the lake, talking to himself. No, not to himself, to someone. I had thought it was harmless, just a quirk of old age. But now, staring into the hollow eyes of this thing, I realized he hadn't been alone. The shadows tightened around me, pressing closer, whispering my name over and over. I felt myself slipping, my mind unraveling. Desperate, I screamed, "What do you want?" The voices fell silent, and the figure leaned in, its face inches from mine, to finish what was started. And with that, everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the dock by the lake, the sun just beginning to rise. I scrambled to my feet, looking around in a daze. The cabin stood silent, watching me. I grabbed my bags, stumbled to my car, and didn't look back. I never returned to the cabin, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I feel a chill in the air, and I hear the faintest whisper. "Daniel." I hear that voice whispering my name, soft but persistent, as if calling me back. I've tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of my exhausted mind. But each time I think I've moved on, the memories claw their way back, more vivid than before. Weeks passed, then months, and I started to think maybe it was over. I focused on work, tried to rebuild things with my girlfriend, and for the most part, life felt normal again. But late at night, I'd wake up with a start, my heart pounding, and feel the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. The worst part was the dreams, visions of the cabin, the lake, and that thing lurking in the shadows. It was as if something in me had been torn open, allowing pieces of that night to seep through into my life. My friends noticed the change. "You're not yourself," they'd say. "You look haunted." I shrugged it off, laughed when they suggested therapy, but deep down I was losing control. Then, one night, almost a year after that terrifying trip, I received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar, yet impossible. It was my grandfather's. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with one line scrawled in the shaky, slanted script I remembered. "Come back. There's unfinished business. The letter was signed with his initials. I dropped it, backing away as if it were something venomous. My mind raced. He was dead, long gone. This was impossible. But as I stared at the paper, something in me snapped. I needed to know. I needed answers. 2 days later, I found myself on the road, the cabin looming in my thoughts. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I couldn't explain it, even to myself. It was as if something was pulling me like a hook lodged deep in my mind, dragging me back to that cursed place. When I arrived, the cabin looked as it always had, quiet, unassuming, almost inviting in the morning light. But the air felt thick, heavy, as though the whole forest was holding its breath. I steeled myself, gripping the handle, and stepped inside. The place looked just as I'd left it, still almost untouched. But as I moved through the rooms, memories flooded back, and I felt a creeping dread build with each step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that at any moment I would turn and see something lurking behind me. I decided to go down to the hidden room beneath the fireplace. The stairwell was damp and smelled of earth, and as I descended, the air grew colder. I reached the small room, barely able to see, and there it was, the leather-bound book, sitting in the exact same spot as before. The symbols on the walls seemed darker now, almost pulsing. I flipped through the book, scanning its ancient pages, searching for some clue, some explanation. Then, at the very back, I found something new, scrawled in messy handwriting. A note read, "You left me here." My blood ran cold. Had my grandfather written this? Or was it something else? The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. I turned to leave, but as I reached the stairs, I heard it, a faint whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. "Daniel." My body went rigid. I forced myself up the stairs, refusing to look back, and when I reached the top, I slammed the hidden door shut, leaning against it as my chest heaved with panic. Then I saw, standing in the doorway was the figure, barely visible in the dim light. Its hollow eyes were locked onto mine, an almost accusing look on its twisted face. I was rooted in place, helpless under its gaze. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, and I felt the icy grip of terror tighten around me. "Why did you leave?" it whispered, its voice carrying a strange, echoing resonance. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My mind raced, trying to understand, to make sense of this nightmare. "What are you?" I finally managed to choke out. Its face twisted into a grotesque smile. "I am what you buried, what you left to rot." And then, in a flash of twisted memories, I remembered. When I was a kid, I had gone fishing with my grandfather one cold October morning. I thought he was talking to himself, but he'd been muttering something about keeping them quiet. I hadn't thought much of it. He'd always been a little eccentric. But that day, he'd taken me to the lake, told me to look away, and there had been a splash, something sinking below the surface. The figure moved closer, reaching out a skeletal hand. "You left me here, Daniel," it hissed. "You let me drown." I backed away, stumbling, trying to grasp the horror of what it was saying. This wasn't just some spirit. It was something we had hidden in that lake. Something he'd wanted me to forget, but it hadn't forgotten me. The figure lunged, and I bolted, my mind blank with terror. I ran through the cabin, down the hall, and out the door, feeling the cold shadow behind me, gaining with each step. As I reached the edge of the lake, I stopped, turning to face it. It stood there, almost pitiful, as if tethered to the cabin by some invisible chain. Its hollow eyes bored into me, and I felt a wave of sorrow mixed with terror. I could feel its suffering, its longing to be free. "Finish it," it whispered. In a daze, I walked back to the cabin, returning to the hidden room. I opened the book, flipping through the pages, and realized what needed to be done. There was a ritual, one that could banish it, set it free, but it required something in return. I was willing to give anything to escape the torment of that creature, to free myself from the nightmare that had consumed me. I followed the instructions, lighting the candles, chanting the strange words inscribed in the book. The air grew colder, and I felt the presence drawing closer. As I finished the ritual, a searing pain shot through my chest. I collapsed, gasping, as the shadows gathered around me, enveloping me in darkness. When I opened my eyes, the cabin was silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. I looked around, expecting to see the figure, but there was nothing. The air was still, the oppressive weight gone. I staggered outside, collapsing on the dock. The lake was calm, and for the first time, I felt a strange peace settle over me. But as I stared into the water, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Just below the surface, a familiar shape drifted, pale and hollow-eyed, staring up at me with an expression of eternal despair. My reflection grinned back at me, twisted hollow, and then, in a voice not my own, I heard the whisper, "You're free now, Daniel, but I'll be waiting for you forever." The lake swallowed my reflection, and I felt the chains of the cabin lift. A weight lifted from my shoulders, yet a piece of me remained, trapped forever beneath the dark waters. The curse had been broken, but at a price.